In the winter of 1241, the end of the world arrived on horseback. Across the frozen rivers of Eastern Europe, an army unlike anything the West had ever seen was annihilating everything in its path. In a matter of days, the greatest chivalric armies of Poland and Hungary were wiped from existence. The forces of the Holy Roman Empire were paralyzed. The Pope ordered frantic prayers. There was no coalition, no fortress, and no king capable of stopping the avalanche of arrows and heavy cavalry tearing toward the Atlantic. Europe was entirely defenseless. And then suddenly, the apocalyptic storm stopped. The invaders packed up their camps, turned their horses around, and vanished back into the vast Eurasian steppe. For centuries, Western historians frame this as a miraculous deliverance. But the truth is far more complex and far more fascinating. The Mongol Empire did not halt its global conquest because it was defeated by superior European tactics, nor was it stopped by a single, impenetrable wall. The greatest military machine in human history was ultimately broken by the only force on Earth strong enough to match it, itself. This is the story of how an unstoppable empire stretched across the known world, only to shatter under its own weight. This is the story of the internal fractures, the bitter family feuds, and the devastating military setbacks that finally brought the Mongol war machine to a grinding halt. To understand how the empire fell apart, we first have to understand the terrifying scale of what Genghis Khan and his immediate successors had built. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It swallowed China, consumed the towering cities of Central Asia, and flattened the princes of the Rus. Their success wasn't just due to sheer numbers. It was a masterpiece of discipline, psychological warfare, and unparalleled mobility. A Mongol army could travel distances in a day that took a traditional European or Middle Eastern army a week. They communicated across thousands of miles using a sophisticated relay system. They adapted to siege warfare by absorbing the engineers of the civilizations they conquered. They were a perfect storm of nomadic endurance and imperial administration. But this perfection relied on one absolute, unbreakable pillar: total, unquestioning unity under a single great Khan. As long as the family of Genghis Khan remained united, the world burned. But Genghis Khan had 4 legitimate sons, and as the empire grew, so did the branches of his family tree. With every generation, the bloodlines fractured, the cousins grew distant. The shared struggle of the harsh Mongolian steppe was replaced by the staggering wealth of conquered palaces in China, Persia, and Russia. The first crack in the foundation appeared in that miraculous year of 1242, when the Mongols suddenly withdrew from Europe. The commander of that invasion, Subutai, perhaps the greatest military genius of the medieval world, was preparing to march on Vienna. But a lone rider arrived from the east carrying devastating news. Ogedei, the great Khan and son of Genghis, was dead. By Mongol law, all senior princes and commanders had to return to the heartland of Mongolia to convene a Kurultai, a massive political council, to elect the new great Khan. The invasion of Europe was cancelled. The political survival of the princes suddenly mattered more than pushing the empire's borders to the Atlantic. This moment established a fatal rhythm. Every time a great Khan died, the empire's expansion violently paused. Armies were pulled back from the frontiers, conquests were abandoned, and the brutal cutthroat politics of succession took over. But what came next shocked everyone. The temporary pauses in conquest began to curdle into permanent divisions. By the 1250s, the empire was nominally ruled by Mongol Khan. He launched 2 massive simultaneous campaigns to conquer the remaining edges of the world. He sent his brother, Kublai, to finish the conquest of the Song dynasty in China, and he sent his other brother, Hulagu, into the Middle East to destroy the Islamic world. Hulagu's campaign was a terrifying echo of the early Mongol conquests. In 1258, he unleashed utter devastation upon Baghdad, the cultural and intellectual heart of the Islamic Golden Age. The caliphate was extinguished in rivers of blood and ink. Hulagu then marched into the Levant, seemingly poised to push down into Egypt and wipe the Mamluk Sultanate off the map. But in 1259, history repeated itself. The great Khan Mongke died while campaigning in China. Once again, the Mongol war machine slammed on the brakes. Hulagu, deeply invested in the looming succession crisis, took the bulk of his massive army and pulled back toward Persia, leaving behind a skeleton force of perhaps 10 to 20,000 men in the Levant. This was the opening the world had been waiting for. In 1260, at the Springs of Goliath in the Galilee, a place known as Ain Jalut, the Mamluks of Egypt rode out to meet this weakened Mongol vanguard. Led by the brilliant and ruthless generals Qutuz and Baibars, the Mamluks did not just survive. They lured the Mongols into a trap and utterly destroyed them. The Battle of Ain Jalut changed the world. It wasn't the first time a Mongol army had lost a battle, but it was the first time they had been decisively crushed and failed to immediately return to avenge the loss. The psychological spell of Mongol invincibility was broken. The Mamluks had proven that the apocalypse could be fought, and it could bleed. But why didn't Hulagu return with his full might to crush Egypt and avenge Ain Jalut? Because the Mongol Empire was finally tearing itself apart. Following the death of Mongol Khan, a devastating civil war erupted in the east between two of his brothers, Kublai and Arik Boke, over who would be the next great Khan. This was the Toluid Civil War, and it fundamentally broke the unity of the empire. At the exact same time, a second equally destructive war erupted in the west. Hulagu, ruling over Persia and the Middle East, found himself at war not with the Muslims or the Christians, but with his own cousin, Berke. Berke was the ruler of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that controlled Russia and the vast steppes north of the Caucasus. And Berke had done something unprecedented. He had converted to Islam. When Berke heard of the destruction of Baghdad and the slaughter of the caliph by his cousin Hulagu, he was furious. In a geopolitical twist that no one could have predicted, Ogedei Khan of the Golden Horde formed a secret alliance with the Mamluks of Egypt, the very men who had just slaughtered Mongol troops at Ain Jalut. The Berke-Hulagu War was a turning point in human history. For the first time, two massive Mongol armies turned their devastating tactics on each other. The vast resources that could have been used to conquer Europe, or Egypt, or India, were instead poured into a bitter, endless fratricidal war over the Caucasus Mountains. The empire was no longer a single terrifying storm. It had fractured into four massive, independent, and increasingly hostile states: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by Kublai Khan. These four Khanites were still incredibly powerful, but their focus had shifted. They were no longer a nomadic wave of conquest. They were becoming settled empires. They began to adopt the cultures, religions, and administrative habits of the people they had conquered. The rulers of the Ilkhanate eventually became Muslim. Kublai Khan declared himself a Chinese emperor. The Golden Horde became thoroughly Turkicized. As they settled, they lost their geographic adaptability. The original Mongols conquered by avoiding pitched battles, using endless grasslands to feed their horses, and striking with lightning speed. But as the fragmented Khanates tried to push into new frontiers, they ran into environments that broke their military machine. When Kublai Khan looked eastward to Japan, he didn't send a swift cavalry force. He sent massive naval armadas. In 1274 and 1281, the Mongols attempted amphibious invasions of the Japanese home islands. But nomadic horsemen were not sailors. The invasions were plagued by logistical failures, fierce samurai resistance, and, most famously, catastrophic typhoons, the kamikaze, or divine wind, that smashed the Mongol fleets to splinters. In Southeast Asia, Mongol armies marched into the dense, sweltering jungles of Vietnam, Burma, and Java. Here, their heavy cavalry was useless, the heat bred disease that devastated their ranks. They faced guerrilla warfare, war elephants, and terrain that negated every tactical advantage Genghis Khan had ever devised. They won battles, but they could not hold the land. The edges of the world were simply too hostile for the Mongol way of war. By the dawn of the 14th century, the expansion was over. The borders were set. The four Khanates occasionally traded, occasionally warred, but the dream of a united world under the eternal blue sky was dead. The fall of the Mongol Empire wasn't a single dramatic collapse. It was a slow, agonizing fragmentation. It was the result of a family that conquered the earth, only to realize that the earth was too big to share. Yet, the echoes of their explosive expansion and subsequent fracturing would shape the next 500 years of history. The destruction of the old Islamic power centers shifted the center of the Muslim world to Egypt, and eventually, to the rising Ottoman Turks. The Mongol unification of the Silk Road, followed by its collapse, forced desperate Europeans to look for new, ocean routes to the riches of the East, a desperation that would eventually lead them to the Americas. The Mongols did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they were human. They succumbed to the same ambition, jealousy, and administrative limits that have broken every great empire in the Chronicle of Ages. They built a storm that swallowed the earth, but in the end, the storm simply ran out of wind. If you enjoy diving into the hidden turning points and epic narratives that shaped our world, subscribe for more forgotten chapters of history. We have a lot more ground to cover.